Hello to all of you. I'm Dr. Yukti Sharma from Department of Education, University of Delhi. Today I am going to discuss with you developing scientific process skills and enabling scientific communication. In this presentation, we would be able to deliberate on the idea of process skills vis-a-vis nature of science. We would be able to discuss the various kinds of process skills in science. We would be able to describe each process skill giving respective examples. We would be able to discuss specific ways in which each process skill could be developed in a science class. We would be able to critically deliberate on the language of science both in context of scientific processes and knowledge. We would be able to discuss various ways for enabling scientific communication amongst learners. So, let's begin by first locating process skills and communication within science teaching and learning. We know that there are three aspects of nature of science. The three aspects of science are scientific knowledge, that is the product, scientific method, that is the process, and scientific thinking or the scientific attitude. Now, the scientific knowledge has developed over the years using certain processes or scientific method. The engagement of scientists with scientific method and scientific thinking has actually led to the development of scientific knowledge. So, if we want to engage learners with science, we have to engage learners with all these three aspects of science. The knowledge, which is the content, which is already there in the classroom, the processes, and the scientific thinking. And therefore, for this it is important that we develop the process skills which would be required by the learners to engage with various processes in science and also to develop better understanding of concepts of science and also to think scientifically. Similarly, scientific communication is also an important part of all three of them because whether it's scientific knowledge, process, or thinking, it has a very unique, specialized language of itself. Thus, we can say that there are certain processes that are an essential and integral part of scientific method. And student needs to be engaged in these processes in a science classroom. And engagement with various processes would help in better understanding of scientific concepts. Also, it would help in understanding the development of concepts in science. Also, it would provide learners experiences similar to that of a scientist. And these skills or these abilities which the learners require for engaging with various processes of science are actually called as process skills. Now, let's understand the various process skills in science and also how can we develop them in a science classroom. So the first process skill is observation. First, let's understand what is observation. Observation is the ability to engage with the materials or objects using senses, directly or indirectly, that is, through scientific instruments. Also, we can say that it is the ability to describe and list various characteristics, minute details using more than one senses, and also the ability to distinguish between materials and objects, as well as to identify various changes around us. That is, observation is not merely seen, but it is engaging with the environment around us using all our senses, whether it's smelling, touching, or it is tasting, means it should involve all senses. So therefore, in order to develop the ability to observe, we need to engage learners in different kinds of scientific activities. Like for example, seeing a plant cell using different materials. We are very familiar with onion peel being used as a material for seeing a plant cell. But there could be other materials also, other unconventional materials which are not used generally. For example, Tradescantia, which has purple leaves and does not require any kind of staining. That can also be used for looking at a plant cell. And it would give them, the learners, an experience that how plant cell look different in different materials, as well as any other kind of plant which is found in your classroom or in your school garden can be used to see or experience a plant cell using the ability or skill of observation. Similarly, differentiating between acidic and basic substances using multiple senses. Here we mean mild acids that are edible also. So we can use those mild acids and make children taste them also, like for example citric acid, commonly found in the substances which are edible and sour in taste. So using taste also as a sense, even the smell, the pungent smell that comes from it, and then the students can experience and distinguish between them using all the senses rather than simply by seeing. So these could be some of the activities for nurturing and developing the ability to observe. Another important process skill which is fundamental to science is classification. We as human beings have an inherent capacity to classify. We are all the time inherently classifying the objects around us. So classification is the ability to define criteria and systematically organize data or observations using it. So in science, when we do classification, we have to first define the criteria using which we are going to classify. And therefore, the first important thing is that we need to develop this ability to define the criteria, to identify the criteria that we are going to use. And then the next step would be to categorize using that criteria into groups and then further into subgroups. How can this be done? So we need to engage learners in categorizing the objects around them. We know that objects around them can be classified or categorized in many different ways. So if we change the criteria, the kind of grouping would also change. So engage learners in categorizing the same objects using different criteria and see how the nature of groups change, how the same object may now become a part of some other group because the criteria changed. Similarly, we can also involve the learners in classifying the organisms around us using more than one criteria. What could be the different criteria that could be used for classifying organisms around us? For example, it could be their habitat, it could be their feeding habits, and many more. So engaging learners in this process would also help them to give an experience of classification. Another important process skill is measurement. Measurement, as we all know, is the quantification of the observations using both non-standard instruments as well as standard instruments. Non-standard instruments are equally important. because these are the ones which were used much before standard instruments were discovered or invented. Hence, in a science classroom, first of all, it's important to understand that how we were using the non-standard instruments for a long time and we are still using them in our day-to-day life. So, the difference between measurement and estimation, or how estimation is a part of measurement. Hence, we should engage learners in thinking and recalling when and how we estimate in our daily lives. What are the various non-standard ways that we generally use? So identifying some non-standard ways of measuring or estimating things, making a list of it and sharing with each other. Then coming to the standard ways of measurement. Why there was a need of standard ways of measurement and what are the various standard ways of measurement? And then applying those standard ways of measurement to some specific experiments. Like for example, experiments that are related to the concept of reflection. What do we measure and how do we measure in these experiments? So engaging learner in some specific experiments where measurement is used will also help them to develop the ability of measurement using standard instruments. Another process skill is hypothesizing. It is the ability to provide a tentative and relevant explanation for the given observation and to devise ways of testing the hypothesis. It is the ability to understand that the explanations are tentative and there can be more than one explanation. So let's take some examples. Like for example, rate of germination is higher in Bengal gram than in green gram. Now, if this is one of the hypotheses, it should further encourage the learners to devise an experiment to test this particular hypothesis and see whether it's correct or it's not correct. Similarly, if suppose on the basis of their ideas related to metals and the properties of metals, and as well as the various kinds of metals, the learner proposes or hypothesizes that soft metals react with water faster than the hard metals, would also trigger the learner to devise an experiment to test it. So hypothesizing is another process skill which is based on the conceptual understanding, but it further drives to devise experiments to test it. Another very important process skills is predicting. Ability to make predictions using relevant evidences and correlating it with the already known ideas. It is important because prediction is different from a guess, because prediction is based on some theoretical understanding, some conceptual understanding. Like for example, if we tell the learners to predict the image formation in reflection related experiments, where we are using different kinds of mirrors or we are changing the position of the source of light. So every time we can tell the learners to predict where the image would be formed or how the image would be formed, and then do the experiment to prove whether the prediction was correct or not. Similarly, changes in a piece of bread if it becomes moist. So whether the learners can predict what can happen to the piece of bread. Another process skill is representation of data or ideas. It is the ability to organize data using certain criteria for grouping or represent in tabulate form and as diagrams, posters, or graphically for representing the correlations or relationships between the data. Like for example, recording data related to rate of refraction of different materials in a tabulate form, which gives a ready reckoner to compare the different materials in terms of their refraction index, or representing rate of enzyme activity in correlation to various factors affecting it. The most important process skill that we have been experiencing in science is experimenting or gathering evidence. where experiment is not possible. And this is therefore the ability to devise a general framework for investigating the given problem by identifying various variables related to the concept and the relationship between them. For example, the students can be told to devise an experiment to show that oxygen is required for burning. Or they could be asked evidences to show that wings of birds and wings of an insect are analogous organs. Because in this case, the experiment is not possible. In most of the concepts which are related to biology, experiments are not possible because we can't have controlled situations. But we can definitely look for evidences. After discussing the various process skills, their meaning, and how they could be developed in a science classroom, we would be discussing about scientific communication and how it could be enabled. Scientific communication is very closely related to the language of science, and language of science is very specialized, both in the scientific processes as well as in scientific knowledge. Now, we have already seen that scientific processes have a very specific meaning, which is universally understood in the same way. Also, the words associated with these processes, whether it's the name of an apparatus or a specimen or a chemical, is very, very specific. Similarly, if we look into the scientific knowledge, we will see there are different kinds of words. And in order to give meaning to different kinds of words, Jerry Willington has given a classification of the words which are used in science. He has classified these words into three levels, and these levels represent the level of difficulty that a learner faces while understanding these words. According to him, the level 1 is the naming words, and the naming words are the most easy for the learner to comprehend. Naming words are those words which are either familiar objects having this, some new names, for example, windpipe. It is a very familiar object for or a body part for a learner, but its scientific name trachea may be new to the learner. Similarly, steel is something which learner experiences in their day-to-day life, but metal as a concept can be new to the learner. Other category within it is new objects and new names. Sometimes the objects are also new and the names are also new. For example, satellite or protozoa, these are names which may be new to the learner as an object also as well as its name also. Similarly, name of chemical elements. We know they all exist in the formal body of knowledge and therefore they may be new to the learner. The level 2 is the category of process words. Again, process words could be of two kinds. One are those which are capable of being shown in the laboratory maybe. For example, transpiration, crystallization. We can see these in the daily life also. If not possible in daily life, we can at least see them in the laboratory. Second category could be not capable of being shown. For example, speciation. Because speciation is a process that takes place across time and space. So it is not, and also it's a process which takes a lot of time, and therefore it is not possible to show it in the laboratory. And therefore, the process words which cannot be shown are comparatively more difficult to the words that can be shown. And level 3, according to Willington, are the most difficult words because they are concept words. And they also can be further categorized into sensory concepts, which are based on shape, size, color, like bilateral symmetry or cores, which can be experienced at least through senses, but they are concepts. And therefore, they have to be understood in the same way as they are understood in the formal body of knowledge in science. The second subcategory are the conceptual words. Conceptual words with dual meanings. For example, cell. Now, cell has a meaning in biology also, and it has a different meaning in physics also. So, with cell, we are talking about sometimes create a confusion because the one which is in physics is something which is easily experienced by a learner, but the one which is in biology is microscopic and cannot be experienced through our senses, and therefore would have different levels of different degrees of difficulty in understanding. And the most difficult words are the third subcategory, which are the theoretical constructs, like for example, evolution. Theoretical constructs are basically those words which are actually not literary words, but they are actually concepts in themselves, which are explanation of certain observations around us, of certain phenomenon that is occurring around us, and therefore they are very difficult to understand because we cannot see them as such, but we can again gather or collect their evidence. We know evolution happens because we can gather its evidences, and therefore it becomes difficult for the learner because the learner cannot experience it through its senses but could only look for its evidence. So based on this taxonomy of words, we can see that how words in science may have different levels of difficulty. So as we have discussed the taxonomy of words in science, now we can quickly think of some implications for science teaching. Number one, as we discussed, the level of difficulty is different for different words. Therefore, we as teachers have to be very careful in using the words in the classroom. So, certain words which we think are difficult for a particular grade level, they could be delayed and can be introduced later. Their synonym, which is more familiar or easy, can be used in a lower grade level. Similarly, lots of examples have to be given for the conceptual words. Now we understand that certain words are conceptual words, so we cannot see them in our day-to-day life, but we can see their examples. So even if the concept name comes later, it's not a problem. If the learners are given the examples, are introduced with the examples of those conceptual words, that familiarity with the examples would help them to better understand the concepts and get more familiar to the conceptual words and its usage. Similarly, theoretical constructs, which are explanations, broad explanatory frameworks for phenomenon occurring around us, cannot be understood till we understand their evidences. So evidences have to be provided rather than simply introducing these words in the classroom. Before introducing these words, it's important that we convince the learners that these explanations are needed, are required for explaining phenomenon around us. Only then they would be ready to accept these theoretical words. Apart from this, it is also important to provide learners some science-based articles for reading, in which they can experience the use of these words and can help in experiencing these words so that it could be used in future. Hence, now we can conclude that development of process skills is crucial for learning science, and their development requires that we engage learners in different scientific processes. In terms of language of science, we have already discussed that it is very, very specialized, and so we know is the scientific method and the scientific knowledge. And therefore, we have to make a deliberate effort to use the language of science in a meaningful way in our science classroom, and also make efforts to enable learners' communication skills in science by providing them more materials to read. After discussing the various process skills and scientific communication, now it's the time to reflect. Here are some questions that you can try to reflect upon and also try to write them. Number first is taking a specific concept. Describe some specific activities for a science class. Discuss the various process skills that can be developed through these activities. Next is develop an activity in science for engaging learners in predicting and constructing experiments on their own. The third is suggest some strategies for a science class that would help in nurturing and enabling scientific communication in learners. Fourth is list some of the words which are used in science that you might be thinking are difficult for the learners to understand and why. Based on taxonomy of words, discuss some implications for science teaching. And the last is that how do you think development of process skills would contribute towards effective learning of scientific concepts? I hope these questions would help you to reflect on what we have discussed in this presentation. These are some of the references given for your advanced reading. Some of these references I have used to make this presentation also. So it would further help you to understand the concepts better. And they also provide some of the activities in relation to the concepts which we have discussed in this presentation. So thank you for engaging with this video.